When the ship runs out of ocean and the vessel runs aground, lands where we know the boat is found. Now there's nothing unexpected about the water giving out. Land's not a word we have to shout, but there's something beside the ship.
Welcome to the Chapter 14 Overview, Empires and Encounters, 1450 to 1750. This is a new unit covering those 300 years. It has 3 chapters, and the first focuses on political empires, the second on economic exchanges, and the third on cultural traditions, although you'll be able to look at spice in all the chapters. So here's a main idea for this one. During the early modern era, empires were formed or expanded in the Americas and Eurasia, with significant regional and interregional consequences. Relevance. Empires are an enduring feature of world history, and in this chapter we are introduced to the states that have been most significant in shaping world events of the last 50 years, helping to create the world we live in today. These empires include, of course, the United States, as well as Russia, China, and India. This chapter describes the impact of European colonization in the Americas, which began a chain of events that transformed the region and created modern states. This era also saw the creation of social and economic patterns that persist to this day and lie beneath the sorts of conflicts we face every day. Setting the stage. This chapter follows up on several states and empires you studied in previous chapters. The first and most significant event in the chapter is the arrival of Columbus in the Americas. As you know, European settlers encountered well-developed societies such as the Aztecs and Incas. On this map, you might recall, the Aztecs were here in orange in Mesoamerica, and the Incas were down here in the Andes region. The Aztecs and Incas themselves built on previous civilizations you've studied, including the Maya in Mesoamerica and Moche in the Andes. Keep in mind some of the significance of a lack of animals in the Americas that could be domesticated, as it explains the difference in technology between Europeans and Native Americans. Next in the chapter, you'll learn about Russia, which, as you will remember, was a relatively new state recovering from the Mongol conquest. Here is the emerging state of Russia in purple, and then the Mongol state was on the border here in brown. After you study Russia, we'll be looking at Asia, starting with China, which we left in the Ming Dynasty, having chosen to recall its voyages of exploration. So Ming Dynasty China is here in orange. Then we'll be moving over to India, and you'll learn about something called the Mughal Empire, which had potential religious conflicts to mediate. After studying India, you'll look at the Ottoman Empire, which is shown in green here. So, the first red heading, European empires in the Americas. By the mid-18th century, Western European nations had established empires that encompassed the Americas, with significant demographic, economic, and political consequences. The European advantage. This section explains why European nations were the ones to establish these empires, starting with natural causes, including the proximity of these nations to the Atlantic Ocean and the presence of fixed winds that made navigation reliable. This is the map you'll be looking at a lot in the book, and as you can see, we've got yellow showing the Spanish colonies. We've got this sort of brown color showing the Portuguese colony in Brazil. And of course we have the French and the British up here in North America. And we have some Dutch territory here in the Caribbean region. In Chapter 10, you learn that during the post-classical era, Europe developed into small competing states. These states had an intense motivation to seek the riches of Asia, and with the failure of the Byzantine Empire to maintain Christian control of Eastern Europe, the best route to Asia seemed to be west across the Atlantic. These are motivations for seeking a route to Asia and stumbling across the Americas, but there were reasons for the stunning success of Europeans there. This section will end with a discussion of technology and political disagreements within American civilizations that helped European nations win such complete control of the region. The Great Dying. The next 2 headings discuss the effects of the arrival of Europeans. This one discusses demographics, meaning how the population patterns of the Americas were affected. You may already know that the arrival of Europeans resulted in a devastating rate of death for native people, in some cases up to 90% of the population. This was primarily due to the lack of contact with domesticated animals, which meant the Native Americans did not have immunity to diseases such as smallpox, measles, typhus, influenza, malaria, and yellow fever. Demographic destruction on this level made it easier for settlers to politically take over the region. The Columbian Exchange. This section discusses the effects of the exchange of goods, primarily food, that accompanied the creation of trade networks between the Americas and Eurasia. This is a part of our course that requires a lot of detail from you. You should be able to recall several examples of goods exchanged in both directions when you analyze the significance of this time period. So pay attention to this diagram here, which has goods that were mentioned in your chapter for sure. And notice that there's quite a lot of things traveling from Afro-Eurasia to the Americas, and also quite a lot of things traveling in the other direction. For items moving to the Americas, the most significant are the staple foods like wheat, rice, and sugarcane, livestock like cattle and horses, and of course, the diseases discussed in the previous section. These have significant effects on the Americas, with livestock transforming societies and the foods influencing the global economy. Going in the other direction, the most significant items that arrived in Europe and Asia included corn, potatoes, cassava, cocoa, sweet potatoes, and tobacco. These crops introduced new economic models and most importantly led to population growth in Afro-Eurasia. For instance, the potato became a staple food in Ireland, sweet potatoes in China, and corn in Africa. European colonies also created new economic models in which raw materials and crops were produced with cheap labor in the Americas for export to an expanding global market. The Columbian Exchange is one of the most significant developments in world history, right up there with the creation of agricultural methods, the dawn of civilization. It is clear that the main beneficiaries of this exchange were the states in Europe, at the expense of American and African societies. Be sure your notes show how Europe benefited from the Columbian Exchange. Comparing colonial societies in the Americas. European colonial societies in the Americas shared a basic economic principle but differed in social and political organization. Before we look at the first heading in the book, let's go over mercantilism. This was an economic theory that provided the structure within which European states created and exploited colonies for political and economic gain. As you know, states like France, Spain, Portugal, and England competed with each other for power, and this diagram shows mercantilism was seen as an important tool in this competition. The basic goal in any trade relationship is to sell more than you buy, or, as you see here in the diagram, to export more than you import. In mercantilism, colonies existed to enrich the mother country, which they did in two main ways. First, they provided precious metals, like gold and silver, which went into the treasury as wealth. Second, they provided labor and raw materials for manufacture in the mother country. These goods were then in turn sold to the colony, creating a closed system that enriched the mother country at each step. So, in the lands of the Aztecs and the Incas, mercantilism was used by all European nations, but the social character of colonies differed. This first section focuses on Spanish colonies in the Americas, shown here on the map. Spain conquered the empires of the Aztecs and Incas, and focused on large-scale agriculture and mining, as indicated by the theory of mercantilism. In doing so, the Spanish created a social hierarchy that reflected the racial realities of the colonies. The Peninsulares were colonists who were born in Europe. Spain and Portugal are located on the Iberian Peninsula. Next, the Creoles were people of Spanish descent born in the Americas. Next in the hierarchy were mestizos, mixed-race residents, usually born of a Spanish man and Indian woman. The Spanish government encouraged intermarriage, and by the 19th century, for example, the majority of the population of Mexico fit into the mestizo category. For clarity, in this diagram, we're looking at percentages from the 16th century. So over a period of 300 years, the population grew to be predominantly mestizo in many Spanish colonies. Finally, we have Native Americans, who generally assimilated into Spanish culture over time and, of course, were devastated by disease. This social order dominated Spanish colonial culture, showing that these settlers imported their notions of class identity to their new world. The next heading is called Colonies of Sugar. This section describes life in colonies of the Caribbean and Brazil. So on the map here, we're looking at the Portuguese colony of Brazil, and then the Dutch and French and Spanish colonies in this Caribbean region. Portugal controlled Brazil, and Spain, Britain, France, and the Netherlands all had colonies in the Caribbean. Europe learned about large-scale sugar production from Arab cultures in the Mediterranean and imported it to the Americas, creating a plantation economy that produced sugar on massive farms. It was a very labor-intensive practice, and the Great Dying eliminated the possibility of a Native American labor force, so Europeans turned to Africa as the labor force. A study of the snapshot on page 636 shows the large percentage of slaves in Portuguese American society. As you might expect, these colonies had a social hierarchy as well, with slaves at the bottom. There was a separate racial category called mulatto, which were the product of relations between Europeans and slaves. On the hierarchy, Mulattoes were on the same level as mestizos in Spanish America. Economically, the plantation system was exported to colonies in North America, which produced tobacco and cotton among other crops. Demographic differences, including the presence of more women, contributed to a different social perception of slaves and less racial mixing. So racial politics in North America differed substantially from those in Brazil, which we're looking at in this heading here. This section points out some substantial differences between colonies in North America and the rest of the Americas. So here we're looking at the orange, which are French colonies, and the green, which are British colonies in North America. Settlers in North America, such as Puritans and Quakers, sought to escape traditional social attitudes in Europe, so they did not import hierarchies the way the Spanish and Portuguese did. For a number of reasons, North American colonies were predominantly populated by waves of settlers from Europe and their descendants. Especially in the North, agricultural production was less labor-intensive, so slavery was minimal. There was also more religious freedom and self-government, which laid the foundation for the revolutions of the 18th century. This section reminds us that environmental and demographic factors played a major role in determining the social and economic structures of European colonies in the Americas. Next, we turn our attention to Eurasia to study expanding empires there, starting with Russia. From 1500 to 1800, the modern Russian state took shape, with a significant impact on the political and economic relationships among Eurasian empires. Experiencing the Russian Empire. At the beginning of this time period, Russia was recovering from Mongol rule, and a new version of the Russian state was emerging centered on Moscow, which on this map is shown here in purple. Due to military conquest, the Russian state expanded over the coming centuries. So in this map, we start with this small state in purple, and then the green, the orange, and the purple, and then the brown over here show this vast expansion and the creation of a Russian empire by the 18th century. To the south and the east of Moscow, which would be down in this region, Russians expanded into grasslands, and directly to the east they expanded into Siberia, which contained great potential wealth from the fur trade. This expansion was harsh, with the state demanding a tax called yasak paid to the state. Assimilation was expected, with privileges granted to those who converted to Christianity and the conversion of grassland into agricultural lands. The end result was the triumph of agricultural civilization over one of the last gasps of nomadic peoples of Eurasia. Russians and Empire. Despite efforts to unify the new Russian state culturally, the empire remained ethnically and culturally diverse. All the colors on this map are different ethnic groups that would be expected to be a part of the Russian state. This diversity and its geographic location between East and West caused Russia to feel threatened from without and within, leading to a reliance on military strength. This empire was known for its autocratic rule and emphasis on power, with the wealth of resources to support it. Historians seek to explain the long life of the Russian Empire into the 20th century. One important reason is that the Russian state was created at the same time the empire was formed, so the social and political identity of the state was wrapped up in the perspective of empire creation. Next, we turn our attention to three empires in Asia. The Chinese, Mughal, and Ottoman empires continued the process of political expansion, bringing diverse cultures into contact with one another, making China an empire. As you may recall from earlier chapters, the Chinese had a long, often tense relationship with nomadic peoples to the north, such as the Xiongnu and the Mongols. In the 17th century, Manchus from north of China, from this region called Manchuria, conquered the Ming dynasty and began the Qing dynasty, which stood from 1644 until 1912. These new rulers set out to conquer peoples to the west, shown here on this map in the lighter purple, and after a treaty with Russia, created the boundaries of a Chinese empire that resembles the boundaries of modern-day China. So that would be all the color on this map. The Manchus who ruled China adopted useful Chinese customs, but did not seek to make this empire universally Chinese, generally tolerating the diversity of conquered peoples. The long-term impact on Central Asia of this expansion, along with that of Russia, was significant and damaging. It effectively ended the mastery of pastoral peoples over Central Asia and the golden years of the Silk Road's trade. So remember, there was once extensive trade networks linking China to Eastern Europe across this region here by the Silk Roads. But now, with the creation of the Qing dynasty and the expansion of the Russian Empire, there are states anchoring either end that are canceling out that network. Empires now relied chiefly on maritime trade, and Central Asia became impoverished under the control of either of the two dominant empires of the region, Muslims and Hindus in the Mughal Empire. As you remember from chapter 12, after the death of Chinggis Khan, the Mongol Empire was split up into several smaller states, and none of them lasted very long. In the 16th century, Turkic warriors who were descended from Chinggis Khan and Timur conquered India, creating the state that you see here, and they came down from the north. They were Muslims, their ancestors having converted to Islam during Mongol rule. Politically, the Mughals, Mughal is from the Persian word for Mongol, managed to impose unity over India, but the main problem they faced was religious: how to administer a state with a Muslim minority and Hindu majority. Two important rulers had opposite solutions to this problem. The first, Akbar, ruled from 1556 to 1605 and pursued policies of tolerance towards Hinduism, employing Hindu elites in his empire and translating Hindu texts into Persian. Some Muslim elites opposed this accommodation and called for enforcing Sharia law and the jizya. Their view was put into practice by Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1707 and reversed Akbar's policies of tolerance. The resulting Hindu opposition to these policies weakened the empire, which became vulnerable to British takeover later in the century. Overall, Mughal rule highlighted the challenges of administering a single state over Hindus and Muslims without coming to a solution. Muslims, Christians, and the Ottoman Empire. Like the Mughal Empire, the Ottoman Empire was founded by Turkic peoples. These warriors began in Anatolia, creating the empire you see on this map. So you can see over the centuries it expanded quite a bit. In purple, we see the Ottoman Empire at its height under a sultan named Suleiman. And then in orange, we have tributary states at that time who were expected to cooperate and pay tribute to the Ottoman Empire. This empire was ruled by a sultan who was both the religious and political leader of the state. Over time, this became the dominant Islamic empire of the era, encompassing the holy cities of the faith. As it expanded throughout Anatolia, it conquered the Byzantine Empire, culminating in the fall of Constantinople and the end of Byzantium in 1453. So if you see here, this is an older map from an earlier chapter showing the Byzantine Empire, which was centered around Constantinople. So here's the Mediterranean, here's the Black Sea. So when you look at this map, you can see the region we're looking at right here is now entirely under Ottoman control. So this is the end of Byzantium as an Orthodox Christian empire in this part of the world. As the empire fell, a majority of its residents converted to Islam. In the Balkans region of Europe, which is this part of the Ottoman Empire, the situation was different. The empire generally accommodated Christians there for a variety of reasons, making Ottoman policy similar to that of Akbar in the Mughal Empire. Christians there were not exempt from control by the state, however. A process called devshirme required Christian communities to send a certain number of boys to the state who were converted to Islam and enrolled in military service. Such policies contributed to a growing concern in Christian Europe with the Islamic threat to the east. Sentiments from the days of Crusades resurfaced after the fall of Byzantium, shaping international relations for centuries. The fates of the empires of this era reveal some continuities of world history about the challenges faced by all rulers who seek to impose rule over diverse populations. So pay attention to those continuities as you take notes on this chapter. Now for the 10-second spice review. New and expanding empires created social hierarchies based on racial classifications. European and Asian powers created land and maritime empires, sparking new exchanges of crops and disease while handling religious differences in a variety of ways. These empires created new economic systems with global consequences. And now the visual summary. Again, this is a chapter with a lot of information in it. We can think of these as early modern empires. This unit is referred to as the early modern era. We started with the Americas, and we looked at the social characteristics of empires in three parts of the Americas. We had Spanish America, the colonies in the Brazil and the Caribbean, and then North America. And after we looked at those, we went to Eurasia and looked at the expanding Russian Empire, the Qing dynasty in China, the Mughal Empire in India, and the Ottoman Empire. And for all of these things, you really should use SPICE to focus on your notes. And basically what you're looking for is the causes and effects of the creation of these empires. And when we look at causes and effects, we're focusing on the ways that the empires administered control over their subjects. That's your chapter 14 overview. Happy reading!
As well as 4x4. Soon the stream of people gets wider, then it becomes a river. river. River becomes an ocean, carrying ships that bear women and men.